In a courtroom where power and privilege meet, a black woman defies an arrogant racist officer, turning the tides of justice with her unwavering resolve. The grand federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. stood as a monument to power, privilege, and the pursuit of justice. Towering columns lined the mahogany-paneled walls, their silent presence a reminder of the weight of the decisions made within these halls. The air crackled with anticipation, tension threading through the packed gallery of journalists, military personnel, and activists who had gathered to witness a trial that could redefine the future of racial justice in the military. At the center of it all stood Olivia Carter. The renowned civil rights attorney adjusted the cuffs of her crisp navy blazer, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room. She had faced formidable opponents before, but this case was different. This was not just another trial. This was a battle for accountability in an institution that had long protected men like the one sitting across from her. Colonel Richard Beckett, a decorated officer, a man revered by some and feared by others. The accusations against him were damning: racial discrimination, abuse of power, and deliberate attempts to silence black service members under his command. For years, his influence had shielded him, his actions buried beneath the bureaucracy and intimidation. Until now. Beckett sat with his legal team, his expression unreadable. His uniform was pristine, his posture unwavering, but Olivia recognized the flicker of arrogance in his eyes. He did not believe he would lose. Men like him rarely did. Judge Harris, a seasoned woman with decades of experience presiding over high-profile cases, entered the courtroom. The chatter died instantly. The court officer called the session to order, and Olivia straightened her shoulders, ready for the fight ahead. As the prosecution's lead counsel, she took the floor first. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not just a case about one man's abuse of power. This is about a system that has allowed discrimination to fester unchecked." Colonel Beckett wielded his authority like a weapon, using rank and influence to degrade and dismiss those who did not fit into his view of what a soldier should be. Today, we shine a light on the darkness he created. Beckett's defense attorney smirked, his fingers drumming lazily against the table as though he had already won. Olivia ignored him. Her focus was on the jury, their eyes locked onto her, some skeptical, some already leaning forward, listening. She introduced the first witness, a former soldier under Beckett's command, a man whose career had been shattered after he reported the colonel's blatant acts of racism. His voice trembled slightly, but his words held firm. Each testimony that followed painted the same damning picture: a leader who used his power not to protect, but to oppress. Beckett's attorney rose for cross-examination, his questions laced with condescension. "Would you say Colonel Beckett was simply enforcing discipline?" Olivia interjected. "Discipline is not silencing men for speaking the truth. Discipline is not denying promotions based on race. Discipline is not retaliation disguised as leadership." Judge Harris raised a brow. "Counselor, let him answer." The witness's jaw tightened. What Beckett did was not discipline. It was abuse. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Olivia caught Beckett's eye, watching as the cracks in his facade began to show. The defense attorney stood, adjusting his tie. He paced slowly, trying to regain control. "So, would you say your career ended because of Colonel Beckett? Or was it because of your own shortcomings?" The witness straightened in his chair. "I earned my place. I did everything right. But when I spoke up, my future was destroyed. Not because of failure, because of him." A shift in the jury. Olivia could see it. The defense's strategy was failing. The facts were too damning. Beckett's crimes too blatant. This was only the beginning, but momentum was building. The battle was far from over. But Olivia had spent her career standing her ground in the face of injustice. She would not falter now. Have you ever had to stand your ground in the face of injustice? Share your story. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the trial pressing against the walls. Tension crackled in the air, a storm waiting to break. Journalists sat at the edges of their seats, pens poised over notebooks, cameras flashing intermittently to capture the unfolding drama. Military officials whispered among themselves, their faces unreadable, while activists in the back exchanged knowing glances. Everyone understood that this case was bigger than one man's guilt. It was a reckoning. Colonel Richard Beckett sat at the defense table, his uniform crisp, his medals polished, his posture unshaken. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth.
His confidence was infuriating, but Olivia Carter had expected nothing less. She stood tall, the prosecution's lead attorney, unshaken by the pressure of the moment. The stakes were high, but Olivia had spent her entire career preparing for battles like this. Her fingers brushed the edge of the podium as she turned toward the jury, ready to present the case that could change the military's future. She took a steady breath. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the facts in this case are clear. Colonel Beckett used his authority not to lead, but to intimidate. He fostered an environment where racial discrimination was not just tolerated, but enforced. Today, we will prove. A scoff echoed across the courtroom. Beckett, I don't take orders from people like you, he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Gasps rippled through the room. A few journalists exchanged wide-eyed glances, their pens flying across their notepads. Military officials stiffened, their expressions unreadable. Olivia, however, did not flinch. Judge Harris's gavel slammed against the bench. Colonel Beckett, you will remain silent unless addressed directly. Beckett merely smirked, as if the reprimand meant nothing to him. His arrogance was suffocating, but Olivia refused to let him control the narrative. She squared her shoulders and met his glare. In this courtroom, Colonel, you take orders from the law. A hush fell over the room. Even the judge paused, studying Olivia with an approving nod. Beckett's expression flickered just for a second, before he leaned back, arms still crossed. He would not concede, not yet. But the moment had shifted. The courtroom belonged to Olivia now. She turned back to the jury, regaining her rhythm. This case is about power, power that was abused, power that was weaponized against those who dared to stand for justice. And we will not allow that abuse to continue. Beckett's attorney cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. Your Honor, this is highly inflammatory. Judge Harris cut him off with a sharp glance. Colonel Beckett chose to speak out of turn. Ms. Carter has every right to respond. The defense attorney sat down, clearly dissatisfied, but unwilling to push further. Olivia continued. You will hear from those who suffered under Colonel Beckett's command. You will hear how careers were destroyed, how futures were stolen, and how a culture of silence allowed discrimination to thrive. She turned to the jury once more, her voice unwavering. But today, that silence ends. Beckett shifted in his seat, his smirk not as steady as before. The game had changed, and he knew it. The trial had only just begun, but Olivia had already won the first battle. How do you think Olivia should handle this blatant disrespect? Drop your thoughts below. The courtroom was no longer just a battleground for justice.
It had become a stage for the unraveling of a man who once believed himself untouchable. The early moments of the trial had been punctuated by Colonel Richard Beckett's smug confidence, his unwavering arrogance, and almost physical presence in the room. But, as the evidence mounted, cracks began to form in the carefully constructed armor he had worn for decades. One by one, witness testimonies painted a damning picture of his leadership. Soldiers took the stand, recounting years of abuse under Beckett's command. They spoke of racial slurs muttered under his breath, opportunities denied without justification, punishments disproportionately dealt to black soldiers for infractions their white counterparts would have received nothing more than a warning for. Olivia Carter listened intently, letting their words speak for themselves. She had no need for embellishment. The truth was damning enough on its own. Then came the documents. Military records detailing complaints that had mysteriously vanished. Internal memos exposing systemic efforts to cover up Beckett's misconduct. Promotions withheld without merit. Olivia laid them out one by one, her methodical presentation chipping away at the illusion Beckett had so desperately clung to. But it was the next piece of evidence that would dismantle him completely. The courtroom hushed as Olivia approached the evidence table and picked up a small device. She turned to the jury, holding it up. "This," she said, her voice clear and firm, "is an audio recording." Beckett stiffened in his chair. Olivia pressed play. The room filled with Beckett's own voice. The recording crackled slightly, but the words were unmistakable. "You worthless black piece of—" The slur hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A journalist in the front row dropped his pen. A woman in uniform clenched her jaw so tightly it seemed to shake. Even Judge Harris, who had maintained a stern, impartial demeanor throughout the trial, exhaled sharply. Beckett's face turned crimson. The silence stretched, suffocating. Then, in a sudden explosion of movement, he slammed his fists against the defense table. Papers scattered. His attorney tensed beside him, but Beckett was beyond control now. "You think you can outsmart me, you black—" His voice caught. The realization of what he had almost said, of the line he had nearly crossed in front of a federal courtroom, flickered in his eyes. But it was too late. The damage was done. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Jurors shifted in their seats. Olivia remained motionless, her face unreadable. She didn't need to react. Beckett had condemned himself. Judge Harris's gavel struck like a gunshot. "Enough," she commanded. "Colonel Beckett, another outburst and you will be removed from this courtroom." Beckett sat back down, his breathing heavy, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. His defense attorney leaned in, whispering furiously, but Beckett's entire body radiated fury. Olivia let the silence linger before she spoke. She turned toward the jury, her expression measured. "This," she said, gesturing toward the still-playing audio recording, "is who Colonel Beckett is when he thinks no one is listening. This is the man who was given the power to lead, the power to decide careers, to dictate futures." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "And this is why we are here today." The moment was undeniable. The shift in the room was tangible. Beckett had spent years hiding behind his uniform, behind his status. But today, in the cold light of truth, he was exposed. What do you think should happen next? Let's discuss. The courtroom was gripped in silence, the weight of Colonel Richard Beckett's outburst still lingering in the air. The gavel slammed down again, sharp and final. Judge Harris's voice cut through the tension with unshakable authority. "Colonel Beckett, you will control yourself in my courtroom."
Beckett's face remained flushed, his chest rising and falling in barely restrained anger. His defense attorney buried his face in his hands, the realization sinking in. This trial was no longer about strategy or legal maneuvering. It was about damage control. Olivia Carter stood motionless, her expression unreadable. She had anticipated resistance. She had expected arrogance. But this unfiltered, reckless display was more than even she had predicted, and it was exactly what the jury needed to see. She took a slow breath and stepped forward. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to continue." Judge Harris nodded, her expression firm. "Proceed, Miss Carter." Olivia turned back to the jury, allowing the silence to settle before she spoke. "This case is not just about one man's actions," she said, her voice measured yet powerful. "It is about the system that allows those actions to thrive. Colonel Beckett did not act in isolation. He was protected, shielded, enabled." She gestured toward the military records stacked neatly on the evidence table. How many complaints had to disappear before someone finally listened? How many careers were destroyed to keep the truth hidden? The jury watched her intently, the weight of history pressing against the walls of the courtroom. Olivia could feel it, the shift in their understanding, the unraveling of the very foundation Beckett had built his career upon. Beckett, still seething, gritted his teeth. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, a silent plea for restraint. But the damage was already done. Olivia continued. "Today, we are not just deciding the fate of one officer. We are deciding whether justice applies to all or only to some." She turned, locking eyes with Beckett. "Colonel Beckett believes his uniform makes him untouchable. That no matter how many lives he ruins, no matter how much hate he spews, he will always walk away unscathed." She let the words hang in the air, but not this time. The prosecution rested its case, the final words settling deep into the minds of everyone present. The gallery sat frozen, the enormity of the moment pressing down on them. Judge Harris exhaled sharply. The jury will now deliberate. As the jurors filed out, Beckett remained motionless, his face unreadable, but his hands clenched into fists. For the first time, the reality of his downfall seemed to set in. The trial had reached its turning point. And for Olivia Carter, justice had never felt closer. Do you believe this trial could set a real precedent? Let's talk about it. The jury had been gone for hours. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable, the air thick with anticipation. Olivia Carter sat with her hands clasped in front of her, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She had argued cases before, had stood on the precipice of justice more times than she could count. But this was different. This was history in the making. Across the room, Colonel Richard Beckett sat still, his face a mask of indifference. His arrogance had wavered throughout the trial, but now, as the final moment approached, he held himself rigid, his jaw clenched. His attorney whispered something to him, but he did not respond. Then the doors opened. The jury had returned. The courtroom rose as Judge Harris re-entered and took her seat. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with weary eyes, stood with the verdict slip in hand. The entire room held its breath. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Harris asked. We have, Your Honor. The tension mounted as she unfolded the paper, her voice steady, as she read aloud. We find the defendant, Colonel Richard Beckett, guilty. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Some murmured in shock. Others exhaled in relief. And then a sound that had never been heard in a military courtroom before. Applause. It started in the back, growing until the gallery erupted into cheers. Judge Harris banged her gavel. Order! There will be silence in my courtroom." The noise subsided, but the electricity in the air remained. Olivia allowed herself a slow breath. She had won. More importantly, justice had won. Beckett's face remained unreadable, but his hands, now gripping the edge of the defense table, betrayed his anger. His attorney, visibly deflated, nodded in resignation. Judge Harris turned to the defendant. "Colonel Beckett, you have been found guilty on all counts. Given the severity of your offenses, this court finds it appropriate to impose the following sentence." The room stilled once more. "You will be dishonorably discharged from the United States Armed Forces, stripped of all rank, and sentenced to federal prison for your crimes." For the first time, Beckett reacted. A sharp breath, a tightening of his jaw. His world, the one he had built on intimidation and impunity, was crumbling. The judge's gavel struck one final time. "This court is adjourned." The moment was surreal. Military personnel in the gallery exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and quiet acknowledgement. Some had doubted this day would ever come. Others had fought for it for years. And now it was real. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Activists and veterans alike cheered, their voices echoing against the marble pillars of the grand building. Signs waved in the air, some demanding deeper reform, others simply celebrating that for once, a powerful man had been held accountable. Olivia stepped outside, blinking against the bright afternoon sun. Reporters surged forward, microphones aimed, cameras flashing. She knew what they wanted: quotes, reactions, analysis. But she had already said everything that mattered in that courtroom. Instead, she turned and looked at the crowd, at the soldiers who had testified, at the families who had lost loved ones to the system Beckett had upheld. This case was bigger than him, bigger than her. It was a step toward something greater. Do you think justice was truly served? Let's discuss in the comments. Olivia Carter stepped outside the courthouse, met with a sea of reporters, activists, and supporters. The air buzzed with energy, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward her, eager voices shouting for a statement. The sound of victory echoed through the crowd, but Olivia did not smile. She did not bask in the glory of the moment, because she knew the fight was far from over. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice carrying over the noise. "We must keep pushing until justice is not the exception, but the rule." The crowd erupted in applause. To them, Olivia had become more than an attorney. She was a symbol of change, a warrior who had fought and won against one of the most protected figures in the military. But for Olivia, this case had never been about personal triumph. It was about the soldiers who had suffered under Colonel Beckett's command. It was about the men and women who had been silenced, overlooked, and cast aside simply because of the color of their skin. In the weeks following the trial, the impact was immediate. The verdict sent shockwaves through the military and beyond. For the first time, a decorated officer had been held accountable for racial injustice within the armed forces. The case sparked widespread discussion, forcing military leaders to reevaluate policies that had long allowed discrimination to thrive in the shadows. Legislation was introduced, calling for mandatory racial bias training, independent oversight of discrimination complaints, and greater protection for whistleblowers within the military ranks. Hope was in the air, but Olivia remained cautious. Change was never instant. The system did not break overnight, and it would not be repaired overnight either. She walked through the bustling streets of Washington, passing newspaper stands with bold headlines proclaiming a historic verdict
and justice finally served. But she knew better than to believe justice was truly served until no soldier had to fear retaliation for speaking out, until no one had to endure what the witnesses in that courtroom had endured. A private ceremony was held to honor those who had testified. Former soldiers who had once faced retaliation for speaking against Beckett now stood with their heads held high. Some had lost their careers, others had suffered in silence for years, but today they were vindicated. They were finally heard. One soldier approached Olivia, his uniform crisp, his expression solemn. "You didn't just fight for us," he said. "You fought for those who never got the chance." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in her chest. This victory belonged to them, to every black soldier who had been dismissed, denied opportunities, and stripped of dignity under leaders like Beckett. Olivia turned to the crowd gathered before her, lifting her chin. "This verdict wasn't just about one man," she said. "It was about dismantling a system that allowed injustice to persist. And it will take all of us to ensure this moment leads to lasting change." The applause was deafening, but Olivia's mind was already on the next battle. There would always be another fight, another case, another injustice that needed to be confronted. But today, the first step had been taken. She dedicated this victory to every black soldier who had been silenced. What's the biggest lesson from Olivia's battle? Let's talk in the comments. The trial had reached its conclusion, but the impact of Olivia Carter's fight for justice would continue to ripple far beyond the courtroom walls. What had begun as a case against one man had transformed into something much larger, a national reckoning with racial injustice within the military. Colonel Richard Beckett's conviction was more than just a legal victory. It was proof that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. For decades, military officers like Beckett had operated with impunity, shielded by rank, tradition, and a culture of silence. But Olivia's courage had set a precedent, proving that accountability was possible, even in institutions that had long resisted change. The military, once reluctant to address its deeply rooted issues, could no longer ignore the conversation. Beckett's trial forced reforms to the forefront, igniting discussions that had been buried for too long. Lawmakers and military officials introduced new policies, mandating stricter oversight on racial discrimination cases, ensuring that complaints were investigated independently, and providing greater protections for service members who dared to speak out. For the men and women who had suffered under systemic discrimination, the verdict was not just justice, it was validation. Their voices had finally been heard. The stories that had once been dismissed as exaggerations or inconveniences were now the foundation of change. Olivia's unwavering stance inspired more than just policy shifts. Future cases emerged, challenging racial discrimination in the military with renewed urgency. Soldiers who had once been afraid to come forward now had hope that their grievances would not be ignored. Attorneys and activists used her trial as a model, proving that justice, no matter how delayed, was still attainable. Despite the significance of her victory, Olivia knew this was only one battle in a much larger war. Racism and inequality did not disappear overnight. The institutions that upheld them did not crumble from a single conviction. But this case had shown the world something undeniable, that the law could be a weapon for change when wielded by those unwilling to accept silence. As she stepped away from the public eye, Olivia remained committed to the fight. She met with policymakers, military officials and advocacy groups ensuring that this trial was not remembered as just another headline, but as the start of something greater. She often reflected on the words of one of the soldiers who had testified. "Justice isn't just won in the courtroom," he had said. "It's won in the hearts and minds of those who refuse to stay silent." Olivia carried those words with her, knowing they were the foundation of every battle yet to come. The trial had ended, but the movement it sparked had only just begun. What does justice mean to you? Let's talk about it in the comments.